Hi, this is Sydney Armani here at the 4th Annual Crowdfunding USA, the National Press Club, second day. We call it Roundtable Discussion, which is one of my favorite in the second day, and we will be open mic, and we're going to be discuss about everything crowdfunding, finance, and we're live, by the way. And I have the honor to have distinguished, guests and also speakers and sponsors of our annual fourth annual crowdfunding USA. So I start with Blaine McLaughlin, Blaine with the folio. Thank you, sir, and for supporting us for the last couple of years. And we have Mr. Mark Roderick, their attorney and crowdfunding attorney. Mark is a personal friend and is writing a lot of articles for Crowdfund Beat, and is one of the experts in this business. So we're going to be hearing from him. And I have honor having June Dormy with the computer share. June is the expert at finance and raising money in the last. Now she's with the computer share. And one of our sponsors, which is with thank you. And also I have the honor to have Michael Holmeyer. Michael is with the EB5 and law office of Holmeyer and Jor and Holmeyer, or Holmeyer is Jor, whatever you want it. And then Homer Law. Okay. Yes. Well, we got, but is very specialized in the crowdfunding and also in EB5. And then I have the rest of the panel. Basically, we're going to be discussing, and they're going to get the mics and start. Let's start with the man of the hour here, Mr. Mark Roderick. Here, you're going to be somehow moderating the whole thing, as you are a good one.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to moderate. Well, we had a very informative and educational day yesterday, and we all, again, want to thank Sydney for having us here and having had us here over the years from the beginning of the... It was an educational day. It raised a lot of questions, interesting questions about the state of the crowdfunding industry today and the future that we might expect in the crowdfunding industry over the coming months and years. So maybe today in our roundtable, actually our square table discussion, we can ask for people's reaction to the question, what do they see coming? What are the current and most important trends in this space, the convergence of technology and finance? How do we think this is going to develop? The industry began with the enactment of the Jobs Act in 2012. Crowdfunding officially began in September of 2013. So I guess that means we're about 3.5 years in, certainly seeing billions, tens of billions of dollars of transactions every year. But where are we going from here? So I'm going to pose that question to my fellow panelists. What are the trends, and what is the industry going to look like, say, 12 months from now? So how about if I turn over the microphone first to Blaine and ask him for his take on that question?
Thank you, Mark. Nothing like being put on the spot with the first answer of the day. I've been thinking a lot lately as we've started to look at the transaction volume in reg crowdfunding and Regulation A, and particularly in also Regulation D, the new part, 506C. And overall, we're not seeing very much. We continue to see on the order of $1 trillion a year go through traditional Regulation D private placements. And those are primarily funds, some amount of sort of angel investing or individual investment, but most of that money is in funds. And on the one hand, the changes brought by the Jobs Act and the activities of the people in this room and many others like us are looking at ways that effectively try and disrupt and displace some piece of that traditional fund business. Or, as we talked about yesterday, maybe it's a complement to. Maybe the fund business tends to follow later stage companies. What I'm looking at now, though, is what can we learn from what's been going on? Is the lesson there that people, in fact, want packaged products? They don't want to have to pick individual companies. That maybe they would like to see somebody else pick the companies, somebody else do the due diligence, somebody else put together the package, somebody else deal with the owners and managers of the company rather than themselves. And that's very anti-crowd, to say it out loud. But I think if we're going to mature, we need to question some of the assumptions about what we're trying to achieve and how, so that we can then go after it. There may or may not be a crowd out there of individual, self-directed, unaccredited, and with enough money to bother and time and care to bother investing in a lot of what we're calling equity or investment crowdfunding. But if we just assume that it's there, I don't think we're ever going to hit it. We have to really look for it and look at who are the investors and what kind of products they want. And so far, not just in crowdfunding, but in traditional investing, non-publicly traded securities investing, it's a mountain of real estate and a big mountain right next to it of venture capital, private equity, hedge funds. So I'd love to hear what other people think about what we can learn from that to take our little niche forward.
Okay. Well, let me ask Joan first, because she's sitting next to me. Is the concept of crowdfunding inconsistent with retail investors in investing in pools of assets, which Blaine is referring to as funds? Does crowdfunding have to be individual assets, or just as most retail investors in the stock market choose mutual funds, where they get somebody else to select the stocks for all the reasons you've described? Is it inconsistent for the retail investors in crowdfunding to invest in funds?
I think my take on that would be that I don't believe that it's inconsistent, and I think if you're going to look at what we've learned so far, the success has mainly been real estate, and it's been pooled real estate, not usually individual project real estate. You do see a certain amount of success in the lending arena where people are lending on specific projects. I guess my standing joke about the real estate end of things is I think that has gained a lot of traction and is working because it's concrete and people understand it. Most people have some expertise in real estate simply via buying a house at some point in their lives, or maybe more than one house. So I think that the crowd relates to real estate based on its own experience. I'm not certain, I think I agree with Blaine, I'm not certain that there is a crowd of unaccredited investors that's just waiting to jump into early stage venture capital. I kind of don't think there really is. And I don't believe there ever will be. But I do believe that there is a crowd for alternative investments and investments that provide a hedge against market-traded securities. I think that is something that, from a portfolio standpoint, if I'm an investor, I think a certain amount of my portfolio should be in assets that are not market-traded, because the market has its own risk, and this particular niche has its own rewards. From my standpoint, I think, too, if we're looking at trends or developing situations, I have concerns about regulation crowdfunding because, to me, it doesn't seem economically viable. If someone needs $125,000 and it's going to cost them X amount in marketing, X amount in administrative services, and X amount in legal fees, I just don't see how that makes sense. If I have a $100 minimum and I end up with 10,000 investors, I'm going to have the ongoing cost of servicing those investors for my $100-and-something thousand. From a business standpoint, that makes no sense to me, never mind from an investment standpoint. So I'm not sure that I think that that end of things is going to work. Maybe if you raise the limits, but even though the current limit is $1 million, I don't know if there have been any that have raised $1 million. I think there's maybe a couple. But by and large, Gene says 3. Okay. By and large, most of them have been, 140,000, 200,000, a few hundred thousand. As a business model, never mind an investment or securities model, that makes no sense at all to me. The other trend that I think I'm seeing is broker-dealers and boutique investment banks are becoming interested in the possibilities of this space and partnering up either with fintech providers and or other types of structures and looking at ways of disrupting the traditional securities processing models. And I think that's an interesting development because that tells me there is some mainstream appeal in that segment of the market to what's going on. And it also tells me that there are people who are creative enough to look at this space and think, there is some disruption possibility here. So how can I adapt and therefore benefit in my business from that? And these are people that have investors. I think going back to something that you said yesterday, Blaine, made me think of that John Dillinger comment about, why do you rob banks? Well, because that's where the money is. Well, in this instance, where are the investors? The investors are with, by and large, broker-dealers. So if broker-dealers don't figure out a way to play in this space and bring the investors, I don't know that there is a crowd that will just flow in by itself. But I think I'm seeing some stirrings in different parts of the market that tell me that that's happening.
Okay, I'm going to ask Michael a question now, which is going to try to be a follow-up on Joan's comments. So I will say that all of what we're talking about, crowdfunding, we have all these legal rules. I always say fortunately, because what else would we lawyers, otherwise they wouldn't need us. But crowdfunding is just the internet. That's all it is, the internet coming to the finance industry. It's a multi-trillion-dollar annual industry, and when the internet comes to industries, it does interesting things. Now, so this is the point, if I can just articulate it. So Jones says, well, where do the investors come from if we can't get the broker-dealers involved and the investment advisors, because they're the folks with the investors. Now, if you had asked, let's say in 1992, and you had said, how does Expedia, what is Expedia's business model? Don't they have to work through the existing brick and mortar travel agents? Because they're the ones who have all the customers. And I think the answer turned out to be, well, the internet is so powerful that it turned out that the travel agents are middlemen whose services it turned out we didn't need. So the question I'm going to pose is, well, is the finance industry going to be like that? Although right now, the broker-dealers and the investment advisors have all the investors, and it seems difficult to pry them away. Is the internet going to do the same thing in the finance industry that it did in the travel industry or the hotel industry or the taxi cab industry? Or is there going to be a reason that investors do, first in a trickle and then in a flood, begin to migrate from their current homes to the crowdfunding industry? And to make it even a more difficult question for Michael, if you don't think that would happen under the existing rules, is there anything that could be done to facilitate or to push the process along to allow the internet to sort of work its magic?
Lucky you.
That's a very interesting set of very thoughtful questions. I'm an optimist about crowdfunding, and I base my optimism on the power of the internet, which I will admit to having underestimated back in the 90s when I was much younger and didn't understand the internet and its power. We have seen money being raised not only in crowdfunding but also EB5 using the internet. It's an extremely powerful marketing tool for our issuers looking to raise money for their projects. I think there's the example of the non-investment or charity crowdfunding, which has really exploded in use, and that's been the model for the investment crowdfunding. There's a long way to go for investment crowdfunding to reach even the level that the charity crowdfunding has reached, or the donating crowdfunding. But I think that that's extremely possible once the internet sorts out how projects can be legally marketed and effectively marketed online. I do believe there's a huge appetite in the middle class, which is my phrase for the unaccredited investors, to participate in investments that are not available to them because they're unaccredited, or are not available to them because they don't know about them, because they're not being marketed. These projects are not being marketed to those people by their brokers, and the brokers are happy to put these middle-class folks just into mutual funds, which are good for what they're good for, but don't satisfy the desire among middle-class investors, at least what they've expressed, to invest in more alternative projects. And I don't mean crazy projects, but I just mean different than what they're being allowed to access now. I think the brokers who control a lot of the marketing and a lot of the access are not themselves fans of alternative finance projects, and they're not in a huge hurry to pull their investors out of their middle-class investors out of mutual funds and drop them into what we would consider to be crowdfunded, including unaccredited investor crowdfunding kinds of projects. Personally, in our practice, both in EB5, which is driven by brokers, but also investment crowdfunding projects, which is not really driven by brokers, it's a question of making sure that the audience is educated to know that the investment opportunities exist. We actually have the impression that the middle class investor pool really wants crowdfunding. They really want crowdfunding, and they want it to happen. They want it to be legal, and they don't know that it now is. And that there are projects out there that they could select from if they wish and invest in. The level of activity has been far less than was anticipated. We all thought that as soon as the laws got passed and the SEC finally came up with the regs, that everybody would jump in. And of course, it's been a slow burn, and part of it is a slow rise. Part of it because there's a lot of standing around the edge of the pool waiting for somebody else to jump in and say, hey, it's fine. Come on in. But also, I think there are still an awful lot of people who would otherwise be interested in investing who don't know there's even a pool. They think, I'd love to go swimming. Too bad they don't build a pool. And I feel like we're saying, there's a pool. There are a few pools. You should consider them. Honestly, my impression is it's more of a marketing issue. And if marketing catches up to the law now, which says you can do this, that people would say, oh, really? I didn't know that. Well, what is there? Where are the pools? What are the projects that we could get into? I think once that happens, and we observers and participants in crowdfunding can look at that and say, okay, we're now there. Everybody knows, the potential middle-class investor pool knows that there are pools out there. Then if no one's jumping in, I would say, people lied. They said they wanted to buy, but they don't really. I'd actually suspect the opposite is true. Not everybody is going to have the guts to really do it when they get the opportunity. They can't just pull the trigger on it. But I think there's the potential for huge improvements, especially compared to where we are right now, over what there is currently right now. I think there's significant chance for growth, which may taper off eventually as those inclined have been reached, but I'd like to see what that looks like. I don't think we're there yet, and I think we can get there, and I think over time we will. Did I answer any of those questions?
Those were fabulous answers. Whether you answered my questions or not, it was a No, I'm serious. That was an extremely thoughtful, somebody who has really thought through this industry and its future. And, I say 8 times a day, it's just the internet, and I say 12 times a day, crowdfunding is a marketing business. It's not a technology business, as people thought in the very beginning. It's not a real estate business. It's not a finance business. It's a marketing business. Now, Blaine, so you, among all of us, I think are at the intersection of traditional finance and crowdfunding. Don't have that look on your face.
Not sure where you're going.
Yeah.
Let's hear it.
Yeah, because your business is based on connecting with registered investment advisors. And so tell us, and you're thereby going to answer questions that Michael was posing. In your experience so far, are registered investment advisors, who are certainly the represent the existing infrastructure of American finance, are they interested in recommending what we refer to as crowdfunding investments, either individual assets or funds, to their retail investor clients? Is it happening on your site? Are these folks making these recommendations with the result that the retail investors are getting into these deals? And do they have enthusiasm for more of the deals, the RIAs? And what kind of deals are they enthusiastic about?
You might need to keep me honest on making sure to actually answer all of those. But first and foremost, I represent a firm called Folio, and Folio is a broker-dealer, and in particular is a clearing broker-dealer. And we think we're the only clearing broker-dealer that's actually jumped in the pool and said we're going to support not only publicly traded securities, not only mutual funds and ETFs and ETNs, but we're also going to support these alternative assets. Big name alternative assets like the non-traded REIT industry with names like WP Carey, KBS, Cole, Inland, and much smaller Regulation A, $30 to $50 million pooled real estate assets, sometimes a REIT, sometimes just a fund, and even smaller, individual companies raising money, aka crowdfunding, whether it's under Reg D, Reg A, or maybe we'll even end up doing some Reg CF at some point. I shared Joan's concerns that Reg CF is a little small on the economics, but some companies, as we heard from yesterday, view it as a marketing channel, and they're willing to incur that expense of shareholder servicing in the name of marketing. So in our experience so far, and we do have a quite large customer base, not quite Schwab large, but pretty large, we have 2 distinct groups of investors. We've got self-directed individual investors, aka the crowd, mostly unaccredited, and we have a very large pool of registered investment advisors who manage their client accounts. Now, one slight difference from your question, Mark, is that most RIAs, at least the RIAs that use our platform, are discretionary managers of their client accounts. So they don't spend much time saying, would you like some? They say, based upon your needs, your timeline, and all of the things we now know about you, this is our recommended portfolio for you, and we will implement it, trade it, keep it up to date, rotate the securities, do the things they do. Whereas there are many a broker-dealer who actually do make the recommendations. And so I'll try and touch on each of those. So far, the feedback from the registered investment advisor community is they don't want to deal with small, high-risk, due diligence-intensive projects. So they tend to gravitate towards the big non-traded REITs, the big managed futures commodity pools, because there's a track record, there's a due diligence done by 2 or 3 or 4 firms, like our friends here from FactRight, also Micklaw, Bowman, and a few others, CrowdCheck included. So they haven't really gone for what we'd call crowdfunding size projects. Will they at some point? I hope so, because we will try and put these products into the infrastructure that they know and they love, and with the due diligence that they can review and rely upon without having to redo it all. For the second group, the brokers, if I take an overly simplistic view of the world and say there's only two kinds, those that do public securities and those that do private, and that is to a degree what we see. The people who focus on private, the quote nickel BD, private placement BDs, really don't do anything else. And the big public security BDs, E-Trade, Schwab, Fidelity, don't really do much in the way of the alternatives, and definitely not as small as anything we'd call crowdfunding. So in that simplified world of public BD, public brokers and private brokers, the private brokers we work with are going gangbusters. Pick a firm like Cambria Capital out of Salt Lake City. They are a private placement alternative kind of a BD. They talk to their customers about these products, and they are selling lots of them. A lot of the Reg A REIT product and some others as well. Whereas the public BDs, I talk with them all the time about, hey, we should be your clearing firm. We should provide these services to you. We can provide these products already vetted, and don't hear back. So it's not just no, it's just silence. That leaves the last group.
Why?
I don't know. I can tell you the words that I hear are, we don't do that. That's pretty high risk. We're not sure that's good for our clients. Our compliance infrastructure isn't set up for that. Our trading infrastructure isn't set up for that, and we're not sure we want to bother to connect to a new firm with new technology in order to do that. One might say momentum, as a summary. Their momentum is that way, not this way. That's to Joan's point, is will that change? I think it will. And then the last, yeah.
Institutionalized resistance.
Right. Yeah. And then the last group is the crowd, the individual investors. And at least so far, and I'll admit that it is a marketing effort and there is a lot more marketing and education to be done, interest level and uptake have been nearly crickets. Many different kinds of offerings, many different, blast emails out to existing customers, people that open emails, not taking any sort of interest, any sort of leap. So that's why I'm questioning our assumptions of, sure, there are people out there, but do they want to do this? And even if we tell them about it, and even if we tell them there's a pool, and even if we show that other people have jumped in, do they want to do this? And I'm not sure of the answer. Over the years we've seen the rise, for example, on the public security side, we've seen the rise of the discount online do-it-yourself broker. And you know what the main business of all of those firms is? Advice. Supporting registered investment advisors and brokers. There's not that many self-directed individual investors anymore. And those that are out there, the call it 20% of the customer base in that space, are the quote day traders. They think they're day traders. They think they can do better, and that's where the big name shops, Fidelity, TD, make their money, is on that small slice of people who trade like crazy. And the evidence is they don't make any money. Not that the company doesn't make money. The company makes a lot of money, but the individual investor, the trader, doesn't make any money. And it brings it around to Mark's last question, then I'll stop dominating the mic on this. Is this going to continue? And if so, why? What regs are making it continue this way, and what regs would make it change? And I would say my observation, which is not something I've spent a lot of time on, so other people may have a much more informed view, that unlike the travel industry and unlike some other industries that have been massively changed by the internet, by connectivity, by openness, the massive number and high complexity of securities laws and regulations, and the not quite 100% requirement, but darn close to it. If you sell a security, if you trade a security, you got to be a broker-dealer, you got to be registered, you got to have FINRA keeping an eye on you, you got to have the SEC keeping an eye on you, and you have to have a huge internal staff keeping an eye on itself, is an incredible barrier to entry that would seem to keep things in the direction they're going of a pretty highly regulated, not as tech, not as open, much more broker-dealer oriented environment than some of these other industries that have disintermediated very quickly. Now, which laws to change that? I'm going to hand that back to a good securities lawyer.
I'll try to recommend one. So far we've been talking like finance people. we've been, because I've been the one moderating, asking the questions. We've been talking about crowdfunding from a very traditional perspective. The assumptions based on sort of yield, investors invest in crowdfunding projects the same way they invest in stock mutual funds, and for the same reasons. However, let's now talk about the other side of crowdfunding. And what I mean by that is crowdfunding investments not merely as financial transactions, but as a unique, brand new in the history of capitalism, kind of interaction between investors and a company. So, for example, I think one of the most successful kinds of raises in the regulation CF world so far is breweries, right? So there's a relationship there. That is a relationship beyond finance, a relationship based on interest. The first big successful Regulation A offering was Elio Motors. And that, I hope, was not based merely on an expectation of profit. It was based on something more, something different. We hear all the time, and I can tell you based on my own personal knowledge, because I have two of them as children, millennials view investing in a way very different than those of us with mostly gray hair view it. In fact, they can't imagine making investments that are not aligned with their own values. That's what millennials, it's become a truism, but I will tell you from my own kids, that's all they're interested in. They want to make investments that are aligned with their values. They also assume everything is going to be technology based. It's not a choice for them. They grew up on technology. They assume their lives will be, their investing lives will be associated with technology. So they use, for their investments, they use the so-called robo-advisors, and they just assume that of course they will. So anyway, they're very aligned with values. They're very aligned with technology. So Joan, looking at it from that perspective, maybe in particular Reg CF, but all of crowdfunding, how does that change things? What does that do to the market? What are the opportunities? How is this different than traditional finance? The fact that our kids, the younger generation, the millennials, view investing a little bit differently than we do.
I guess I'll try and tackle that one. I have a couple of them myself, and I don't believe they do all that much investing, but I would say there is that alignment of interests with investment. They wouldn't invest in something purely on, I think, a financial return perspective. It's more, am I interested enough to look at this investment? And I think if we look at situations that have been successful from a marketing standpoint, there is that retail or consumer product type appeal where there's a fan base. So if you're doing a Regulation A+ offering and you have some sort of fan base that you can market to, that gives you a big leg up in raising your money. And I think that's one aspect. So you have the fun car company type thing, or you may have, real estate is the other thing that's been very successful just because I think it's well understood by an individual consumer. In the technology end of things, to me, one of the biggest boons in fintech is the securities world has always been well known for inefficient and cumbersome processing. So I think one of the big changes from an internet perspective is the ability to do full disclosure more easily than shipping out a giant prospectus. You can put up all kinds of both disclosure and marketing materials within reason and within the rules, more than you used to be able to. Now, once upon a time, back in the dark ages, I worked for a firm that did real estate investment banking, and they were well known for producing coffee table book prospectuses, which was very unusual back then. So it would be lots of pictures to give someone a feel for what they were investing in. So what we see now on the internet is that type of investment flow. If you look at a bunch of portals, you'll see they all look very different. They all look very similar structure-wise. They have the little boxes or panels with sort of a little snapshot of what a deal is. Maybe it's a picture of a property with the amount of the fund. Maybe it's a little blurb about this is, a cool jet company that's the Uber of jet travel. So you'll see that sort of, it's a marketing format that has evolved. And when you go in and look, you can look at the prospectus, you can look at the company's financials, you can usually look at a pitch deck or a video that gives the elevator pitch for why should I invest in this company. And people are coming, but it's largely accrediteds that are coming to places like that. So I would say that hasn't trickled down into the crowd yet to a large extent. Can it? Let's go back to your question about, or your comment about Expedia and disintermediation. We're both having trouble with that word. Disintermediation of traditional middlemen. The internet has done a lot of that. In the finance and investment world, what I see is getting disintermediated is the cumbersome processing and the inefficiencies of trying to scale up, getting in a lot of investors with a whole boatload of cumbersome paperwork. The internet has really smoothed that road out a lot. But what I'm not sure it smooths out is if you look at industries where there has been a lot of disruption, it's maybe along the lines of, did I need the middleman? Because travel agents used to have special systems that they could access to get information that the rest of us didn't have the ability to see. So being able to do that directly did away with that. It also has now evolved into commodity and just-in-time type pricing. So I can use something like Hotel Tonight if I need a hotel room tonight because the hotel is selling its unused capacity. That's a commodity. I know what a hotel room is. And if you look at sale of books, records, the success of places like The Gap, that was commodity clothing. You had 6 different white shirts you could pick from. Everybody knew what they were. You didn't have to go to the brick and mortar to see it. It was well understood. I'm not sure investments fall into that category. So I'm not sure that technology will completely disrupt and disintermediate actual advice of people that are focusing on investment products and investment values. I think some degree of that will happen, like the robo-advisor thing, but you're already seeing a lot of, mixed reviews of whether robo-advising really works and whether it will completely replace everything. Clearly, Blackstone thought it would, since they fired all their advisors. But I'm not sure that is going to be the end result of how technology is implemented. I do think that the millennials' use of technology makes them more apt to be direct investors than some of us with gray hair. Although I have to say I've been an online person for quite a while. I don't keep paper, I don't have files, everything's electronic with me. But I know that that's not the norm for people in my generation, where it is more the norm with my kids' generation. So I think that the technology, I view it as a tool. And those that figure out how to use the tools most effectively will be the winners. And I also think that financial firms that play in this space in the traditional way are looking at how do they market to millennials. I think one of the challenges in marketing to that segment is the burden of school loans is pretty significant. So how much investable capital do the millennials have? A lot of them aren't buying houses at the ages or stages that many of us in this room did. But maybe that means they're more apt to invest $1,000 or $100 in a crowdfund investment because they're not investing in real estate the way that I did when I was in my 20s. So I think there's a lot of interesting factors that come into play here. I think the picture's still really unclear, but I do think that marketing is a big key to this, and I think that using the technology to create the efficiencies is a really important part of this. I'm still not totally convinced that there's a big crowd out there of people that want to invest in individual companies, because if I'm an unaccredited investor and I have $5,000 a year to invest in alternative stuff, do I want to throw it all at an experimental car company where I could lose it all? Is that my best decision? Or do I want to put, $100 or $500 into 3 different pooled real estate funds where I'm not investing in a single property? So I'm spreading out my risk from an investment standpoint. I think people who are self-directed investors think pretty carefully about stuff like that. So that's my answer.
Okay, well, thank you for that answer. And of course, as the moderator, I get to comment on things.
That's half the fun.
So I share your, I think we all share your question of how far can this go? Are investments different than hotel rooms? I tend to believe personally, I know that the highly educated, highly successful members of the board of directors of Barnes & Noble, for example, I know they sat around a room like this telling one another all the reasons why it wouldn't happen. Why their customers absolutely wanted to come to a Barnes & Noble store to buy their books and have a coffee and meet with friends, and it just was not going to happen. I do know that. I do know that partly because I and my partners, lawyer partners, we sit around telling ourselves, well, of course all these other industries have been, really affected by the internet, but not law. They need, our clients need us. They want to talk to Mark Roderick, right? So, we all do it. We all suffer from that "it couldn't happen to us" syndrome. And even a company like Walmart, retailer, they've been sitting around telling themselves for years, Amazon is a blip, personally, I don't know how it's going to happen, and I don't know that it is going to happen. I just have this suspicion that the power of connecting buyers and sellers directly, which is all the internet does, will somehow, change things up. So, Michael, I'm going to ask you, both if you have any further thoughts on this whole value investing concept, how much that might change things around, and also to speculate on what technology could do, how it could allow the industry to scale, how it could change. Right now, the technology in the crowdfunding industry is really very elementary, right? You have a website, and yes, you can make an investment online and the money's deducted from your bank account. Fantastic. That's just Amazon. That's just basic shopping cart 1998 technology. Is there more to come? Can technology replace or partly replace the traditional due diligence process? Now, of course, when you ask that question of real estate developers, they say, no, technology can never replace what I do. I'm an expert. Can it help investors? Can artificial intelligence help investors scan deals for important points? But just letting your mind kind of wander freely, is there more that technology can do to change the fintech marketplace?
Bless you. As a lawyer, I have to answer that yes and no. As a securities lawyer, let me speak from the perspective of my firm has been blessed to get a lot of experience doing private offerings in EB5 and in crowdfunding and in private equity over the last 8 years. We've done over 500 projects. And to me, there are two aspects to every project from the perspective of a securities lawyer: the marketing side and the legal side. And they are highly different. And my answer to your question is based on that dichotomy. I think that technology will continue to enhance the marketing aspect of an investment, the marketing of an investment opportunity. I don't think it is anything other than an easier way to access legal documentation and financial documentation like financial statements and feasibility studies and things like that by making them more accessible to an investor in one place. They can always go back and look at it again. Perhaps there will be accurate translations. Maybe there are ways for people to get additional information in order to understand some kind of technical or financial concept. But I really don't see the internet and technology changing the way that you satisfy the legal obligation to disclose to investors all of the potential upside and downside of an investment opportunity. I think that the marketing, which is different, can be made sexier, easier, quicker, jazzier, whatever ear you want to come up with, better, okay, over time. One day you're going to be able, I'm sure, to have alternative reality ways to walk around the hotel room before you rent it and say, I'm looking out the window, even though I'm not there, and I really like this hotel room because the view is spectacular. I mean, stuff we can't do now, that kind of thing, but that's marketing. I see that, and technology getting us to that kind of a point, and beyond that, yeah, I can see that. What's not going to change is the fact that my job as a securities lawyer is to write the investment papers, not the marketing papers. And when I write the investment papers, I'm writing using content from the marketing materials, but presenting that information in hopefully a more sober way, a more dispassionate way, and not to offend people, but on a third or fourth grade level. Because these documents, the investment papers, you want a good issuer, a person raising the money, wants the investors to understand what they're getting into. Because if they do, not only does that protect the investor, it also protects the issuer, the business owner that's raising the money. You don't want investors to be unhappy. You want investors to know it's not a sure thing. You want investors to say, I can take some bumps in the road because I knew that there could be bumps when I came in, and when it happens, I'm not going to panic because I was told. I really think that the PPM, the private placement memorandum, is going to remain the same. It is going to need to communicate information on a level that a middle-class investor can understand. We've got plain English requirements by the SEC that are pushing people in that direction. And to a greater or lesser degree, we changed all of our securities documents to go with the plain English standard. But we've always tried to write clearly and straightforwardly on behalf of our clients, to investors, so that really an investor can read the offering document, and I'm just saying the PPM, and understand really what this investment is about and what are the risks and what are the potential benefits. Of course, we attach the legal contracts like the subscription agreement and the limited partnership agreement so that they can go and, if they wish, check those documents to see if the disclosures in the PPM are backed up in the documents, in the actual contracts. Because remember, a PPM is not a contract. It's not signed by investors. It's just giving them the information, like a summary of the information that is contained in the actual contract. I don't think that technology is going to be able to change much how that information is communicated. It might make it easier. It might make it more searchable. You could find certain things more readily because of technology, but I don't think that technology is likely to offer a substitute for there being an official set of disclosures that an issuer makes to satisfy the securities obligation of sharing all material facts about the investment with the investors and the corollary in a way that the investors can understand. I don't think that's going to change.
Can I ask you just you've made investments online, I'm sure. You see how the wonderfully written disclosure document, or PPM, is presented. It's presented often after the investor hits the Invest Now button. Well, wait. I mean, I'm asking you this question. When it is presented, either before or after the investor makes the decision, it is presented in about a quarter of a screen. Let's say there's a 100-page PDF, and it has a little of a screen, and the investor needs to scroll down inch by inch to read it. And next to it, it says, click here to sign. How many of your wonderfully written, and I'm sure they are, offering documents, how many online investors do you suppose are actually reading them? Okay.
That's a great question.
Thank you. Okay, and you're going to say not many. And so the question is, can technology change that?
Yeah, and the reason why I think it's such a great question is because a good issuer wants the investor to read it, wants the investor to understand, and issuers who don't are violating the securities laws, at least in spirit, and probably with that attitude, if they've got that kind of a presentation on their website, I would suspect there's a very high risk the SEC would look at that and say, that's not effective disclosure. And I would therefore advise that client, that's likely not effective disclosure, and you should really do it. I mean, if you're going to do it, do it. Now, if an investor chooses not to review this stack of information that we're compensated to provide, the SEC has always said, you've satisfied your responsibility, Mr. or Ms. Issuer. You've made that information available. It gives the investor the opportunity to make an informed decision. If the investor chooses to make the decision without the information, that's their choice. And in the state of California has a different attitude. But under federal law, it's pretty much assumption of the risk by the investor if the issuer makes that information available. And hiding it or taking advantage of technology to make it difficult for investors to access the information, I think, is highly risky because you're essentially doing the opposite of making the information available. You're essentially concealing it. It's a pro forma kind of form over substance disclosure where you know that investors are highly likely not to read things. We actually write documents in order for investors to read them and get the information. Obviously, some will not. But the legal obligation is that we give them the opportunity to, and that we make those documents, if they choose to exercise their own personal responsibility to protect themselves on their investment decisions, that they actually are going to read it and they'll be able to understand what we say in the primary disclosure document, even if the chance of them going beyond that to look at the supporting exhibits that are supposed to back up that information won't be there. If the feasibility report says there's no demand for this product type in this community, there's a saturation of hotel rooms, and we don't see any need for this hotel to be built in this neighborhood. Well, first we tell our client, why are you offering this to investors? Because when they read that, they're going to say, I'm not going to invest in a dog of a project. But we want to make sure that the investor has that information and that it's included in the summary of the PPM. I don't mean the summary, but I mean the information is summarized in the PPM so that they're put on notice and they can go take a look. I think that there needs to be a marriage of the issuer honoring his obligation under the law to provide that to make that information really available. I think technology can help it. I do. But technology could also be used to conceal the information and make it less attractive and not therefore really available. And I think issuers, the SEC is aware of technology enhancements, and they can see that technology can be used to obscure rather than to enlighten. And they will not, I'm sure, look kindly upon issuers who take advantage of technology to conceal, let alone to deceive, because that's the next step to securities fraud, is when you either hide material information or you don't describe what it is in fact you're going to do with people's money. I don't think that's going to change. And I honestly think that the average millennial investor should be held to the standard of personal responsibility for making an investment decision to act. As long as that information is available to them, which is the legal obligation, they ought to read the darn stuff and inform themselves as to whether or not they want to invest in an electric car. And perhaps they look at it as a so-so investment, but it's a personal value to them, and that's fine, because we all make decisions on what to invest in part because it works for us. But the legal requirement, I think, is going to remain the same. I think it can be enhanced, but it'll never be replaced by technology. And I think that's not the problem in crowdfunding, that the legal documents are too long or too complicated. I mean, in many cases, I know they are garbage. We've seen stuff. We've been hired to fix papers. I think a lot of the other securities lawyers have been brought in to do fix it because the issuer or marketing people say we can't communicate garbage. Otherwise we're not protecting the investor and therefore not protecting ourselves. But I really think that it's more of a marketing issue. I think technology looks to be a marketing tool, and that's fine as long as the legal is there to say, but there's a potential downside. So that's why I said yes and no. I really think that it's going to change marketing hugely, bigly, nowadays, but I don't think it's going to change the legal, and I don't think it should. And I think that investors, young or older, should have the responsibility to read the legal papers as well as the slick and glossy, gee, this is going to be fantastic marketing stuff.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we have an A here, so maybe we should have some Qs.
Queue up in the queue.
So, yeah, let's start. I guess raise your hand if you would like to ask a question or simply to talk, because you've been listening to us for a long time.
So there's about 120 people online.
Oh, are there?
Hi, everybody.
How many are watching us?
I thought there were more people online.
No, 120 people today. Yesterday was about 18,000.
18,000.
No, we had 25,000 yesterday.
25,000.
25,000 people watched the broadcast.
Yeah. And that's
several LinkedIn requests for people to mention the broadcast, believe it or not.
yeah, and that's what we shoot it everywhere, but it's gonna be the video already there. But today right now it's about Friday 100. I mean, we didn't promote a lot of it, but we didn't want to do live broadcast, but we just decided
We're going
to
out live and they can't hear you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you for watching. Stay tuned after these messages.
There you go.
Question.
All right, I have a
The
question.
messages from, Mark Rederak, Blaine. Can you advertise, by the way, about your firm and other things?
Sure. Ask your question.
No, ask, please.
Okay,
Please ask your question.
All right, so I'm Pat Tracy. I'm at the Computer Share Group, one of the sponsors of the event tonight. I work with Joan. But I don't know who addressed it specifically, but kind of half a rant and half a question. It's like, I don't understand, like one of the problems that, we keep hearing about is, there aren't many deals out there. And I think one of the things, that as an industry we could try to focus on is kind of preaching this to other areas. And I think the technology aspect you all were talking about is very important, but I still think that, the personal sell and personal attention, is something that would be, missing in this whole marketplace that we need to get back to. Just by way of reference, I grew up in the business working with, community banks or actually mutual, banks, bringing them public. And they had, in order for a bank, or insurance company for that matter, to go public, they have to first distribute the shares or give their members, the opportunity to buy the shares in a community offering. And so I've been doing it, since I don't want to say how many years ago, but Rick Astley was topping the charts back when I first, started working on this stuff. I am, but I'm not admitting to how old I am, type thing. And still going on now. We just recently worked with an insurance company, a mutual company in North Dakota that went public through a subscription offering, and also worked, on the Boston Beer when they went public. They did it in both in an IPO and they modeled after a community savings bank deal where they offered the shares to their members, aka beer drinking customers, and the community at large. So I just think that there's a great opportunity, and I guess maybe Mark and yourself, Michael, might be good to ask. Why aren't community banks, like stockholder-held banks, say in Potsdam, New York, or Asheville, North Carolina, wherever, and they have like 200 shareholders. It's a lot of people inside. They need to raise $20 million, and just from calling on some of the law firms here in Washington over the past few trips down here, it's like they're not focused on this. They're doing other vehicles to try to finance these things. And I'm thinking, if they wanted to go in and raise, $20 million, from the community, because they have depositors, they have borrowers. If you're in Allegheny County, New York, you can make that the offer member to all people in the community there. And I'm just thinking, that, also it could be other things. Like I know the kids, and I'm probably financing this on Sunday, Mother's Day. We're going to like the hot new restaurant in town, Barache, but it's a small group that owns about 4 or 5 restaurants, and you can't get in, and I'm just thinking that if they wanted to grow and expand by make 3 more restaurants or 5 more hipster bars in Astoria or New York City type thing, why don't they just go out to their customers and, buy shares in this, and you get, on Thursday nights, or Monday nights, you buy one, get one free, type of thing where they can really get their customers involved. Like in the bank example, they used to have what they call community offering meetings where the board of the directors would get together and meet with depositors and community members to, explain the pros and cons, of buying and selling the shares.
A client called me recently, a bank in Newport Beach, and they wanted to investigate crowdfunding. First of all, correct me if I'm wrong, but banks are exempt from registration. Is that true? By and large, they're exempt from many of the onerous things that a company would have to go through for an IPO. They didn't need me. They came in, we had a nice meeting, we're all set to go, and they had a whole bunch of money come in from exactly what you're talking about. So they didn't really need to do that. They had they got, I don't know, I think they're looking for 5 or 10 million, and they got it right away from people in the neighborhood.
Yeah, so the deal we worked on in North Dakota that they closed in March. And they oversold the shares in members, and they didn't get to the IPO. They had a full commitment IPO on back of it, but they blew out the share offering. I'm just thinking that, maybe kind of a wishful thinking on my part is, as a group, is there anything we can all do to kind of spread the gospel of this, to these affinity groups? I think you go to a city like Detroit, I would love to buy a square block there and have it crowdfunded, to build, stores, restaurants, things of that nature. I mean, what do you all think about that? And I was also my specific question, was there any reason, why, I'm thinking community banks, credit unions, people that have a lot of customers that they, can relate to and they have their names, and they also, have a community that they serve. And where, the one thing I think as an investor, where I'm different from the millennial kids, is I want to be able to see and touch, my investment. And if I can go into the bank and, make sure that, Sally or Jim is still behind the desk there, and go to so when we go to the restaurant on Sunday, hey, we're thinking of opening up a place, 4 towns over, get me on, sign me up. So I just wanted to, on the banking credit union, that's where my background is. And, I just think seeing it been very, very successful. And I'm just thinking that it's a natural affinity where, businesses that have a lot of customers and residents in the community, is that something we can do a better job as citizens of this, ecosystem to try to promote it and get out there?
Yes. By which I mean, if people will participate if they know there's something in it for them. And if the bank believes there's an opportunity for them to make money the old-fashioned way, and it doesn't take much energy, they default to that. If I think there was an opportunity that they thought they could do and fit within the regs that are imposed on the banks, some of those who are more entrepreneurial-minded may well be the ones who make the first move.
Yeah, and I have one other point I forgot to make. I don't know if they can hear me or not, but you
Can't
can
hear
repeat
you.
it. Yeah,
Can't hear you.
you could repeat it. Just, if you have an investor, who's a customer, it makes them more sticky to the bank, in this case as a customer, because, it makes them less likely to go to Wells Fargo down the block, if it's, Potsdam, New York Bank, type thing. And that's another thing that I think is, for customer retention, and customer development, I think it'd be very helpful.
I think for customer retention, if the bank felt that by participating in crowdfunding, that they were enhancing their bottom line by doing good for their depositors, they might be inclined to go in that direction. If they could otherwise get their arms around it, I would imagine they'd be likelier to get their arms around it after seeing, again, this is my analogy of the pool, seeing that other people jumped in and didn't get drowned. But banks are often not leaders, and instead they're inclined to follow.
Lemmings.
Never leave.
Right. There are a few exceptions. You can find, but the bigger banks and the non-community banks are even less likely, in my experience. And I think you were asking Mark also. What, Mark?
Yeah, I just put your thoughts too.
Yes, and I'll answer the question more generally about affinity groups, because yes, affinity groups are a perfect opportunity for crowdfunding, and they range. There's all kinds of affinity groups. The breweries are affinity groups, and they have been quite successful raising money using crowdfunding. On a more serious note, the example I always use, because I have unfortunately, some personal contact with it, affinity groups like victims of cystic fibrosis and their families, and choose any other, ALS, breast cancer, all those are affinity groups with very powerful emotional attachments. So I've thought from the beginning that, if you had a biotech startup investigating cystic fibrosis therapies, that is a very powerful attachment, and not only for raising capital, but as I sort of suggested earlier, the most powerful kind of crowdfunding is where it's not merely a financial relationship. So if you take an example like cystic fibrosis, and you involve the families, tens of thousands of families who have been affected by that horrible disease, there can be a reciprocal relationship between the biotech and the families. It's not just money, it's information. What are the problems what are the most serious lifestyle problems we face? What do we care most about? So there can actually be a reciprocal relationship. Just as with the breweries, well, what kind of beer do you want us to make? But, either on a superficial or a deep level, affinity groups are perfect. Restaurants, we represent a restaurant considering a Regulation A raise. It's perfect, as you suggest. You put a card in everyone's menu, okay? And this is particularly useful now that we have Regulation A, so you don't have to distinguish your guests who are accredited from those who are non-accredited. But this is a perfect opportunity, and there are many, many examples of those affinity groups. And yeah, it's going to be powerful. And how are they going to find out about it? They're going to find out about it from friends or the internet or something. And it's just going to start to happen. And once one restaurant does it, all the other restaurants are going to want to do it. So that's one of the reasons that I see, really steady or even explosive growth for this industry. Okay, questions? Criticisms? I know you probably have criticisms of Michael. You want to make? No.
Who isn't here?
Yeah. Who is it?
I'm William Eilers with Eilers Law Group. I practice securities law and just starting to get into this crowdfunding. I think generally I share a bit of the skepticism that Blaine kind of summed up with, there is no crowd. And one thing I was thinking when you were speaking generally of this value proposition is that I think we underestimate the actual value of, or the competition that comes from a Kickstarter or a GoFundMe or these programs. And I think of a client of mine, that fairly wealthy gentleman who would write a check for $100,000 to a charity without blinking an eye, but to write a check for $25,000 for an investment, he would slow down and would do an entire due diligence. And it's not because he's wealthy. I think that is generally a human characteristic. If I'm putting money at risk and I have an expectation, and I think that's where this huge battle of trying to collect this crowd is always going to come into. Absolutely.
Can I ask you a question? Okay, so now that was a sort of either-or proposition. So let's say this gentleman is unfortunate enough to have had a family member affected with cystic fibrosis. So he'd write a $100,000 check to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Now, what if there's a biotech startup that is developing a promising cystic fibrosis therapy? Does he pause with the $25,000 check as much? In other words, what I'm suggesting is for that person, a way into crowdfunding may be investing in accordance with his values as opposed to viewing it as a purely financial transaction. I'm just suggesting that there's a spectrum, a spectrum of this is purely finance or this is something that I really care about.
And I think that's the difference between like Indiegogo and Kickstarter versus investment crowdfunding. Investment crowdfunding is more complicated. You're not just sending your money off and saying, I hope it does good, it might not, but if I know the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation and it's reputable, I believe that my money will go toward a good cause and perhaps there'll be a cure one day. You know, in an investment, you got what are the terms? What are the chances? What are the risks? Might I get... So when your motivation is different, you're looking at it as an investment as opposed to you're making a gift or you're supporting somebody's honeymoon. I'm not sure who would do that if it's not family or friends, but you know, whatever people are doing for charity or donative crowdfunding. When it comes to investment crowdfunding, you know, it's more complicated. People need to know what are the terms and what are all the possibilities.
Just in terms of skepticism, I know that when Kickstarter came out, wasn't that long ago, I was absolutely sure it would fail, right? Because I'm a skeptical securities lawyer. I've been doing this for 4 years now. That's how, you know. No, I've been doing it for many. Yeah, right. No, I say I started practicing law in 1840. But, you know, I know how hard it is to raise money, even when there's a chance of a return. And so I and all my partners said, there's no way, you know, that people are just going to give money for nothing. You know, and that was, how much money has Kickstarter raised now? $2 billion? Certainly the billions, like the McDonald's sign, have started to, you know, roll over. And
they've rolled into investment crowdfunding.
And Indiegogo has rolled into investment crowdfunding, which seemed like a very natural thing for them to do. So, again, there's this skepticism. We are skeptical that people will part with their money. That was the perfect example. They don't get anything. And yet, I will catch myself there and say, well, that's a stupid thing to say. They won't get anything. Because if they really weren't getting anything, they wouldn't write the checks. So our job actually is to figure out what they are getting. Because what they are getting in the Kickstarter context is transferable to our industry. Some are pre-selling products. But they're getting something else, I argue. They're getting a sense of personal fulfillment. They're getting a sense of community, because when you give money to one of these people, we're making our first CD, we're a band, we're making our first CD. You're on a mailing list. You get updates. You get a sense of community in our increasingly decommunitized society, where we're all just kind of these isolated islands sitting at our computer. We get a sense of community that we don't get otherwise, and that is a very deep human need, a sense of being connected with other human beings. I'm not a sociologist. I can't tell you all the things you get, but you get something for sure. And whatever those things are in the Kickstarter world, we should also be thinking about in our world. I think they're equally obtainable. Yes, sir, you have a question.
And it's Dave Blankenship in St. Louis. I'm helping small businesses to figure out how to get on a platform and to run a campaign. So I think some of the kind of thing that's happening with reward crowdfunding on Kickstarter is starting to happen now in the platforms and portals that are for investment crowdfunding. So WeFunder now, I believe, allows some rewards in addition to just the investment alone. And then to what you were talking about a while ago, where they just click through, and I guess I'm thinking of the terms, does the carpet match the drapes or such? Does the marketing material match the legal material out there that's the risk and all of that kind of stuff? Because then probably they're okay. If not, then maybe there's going to be lawsuits out there. But as long as they can read through it, or they should read through it, I agree, that is going to be good. But there needs to be that ability to do the due diligence. And it's maybe not being done out there. And that seems to be one of the big problems with getting the crowd in a lot is, how does that large set of people get out there and be able to say, well, I was part of investment clubs in the 90s, and we would look deeply, but only at public, stocks and such. But everybody's also doing the lottery tickets in some cases. They want to get rich. They want to get in on the Facebooks. So I think that maybe they'll learn to do it some on their own, but I have a feeling it needs to be the registered investment advisors. It needs to be those people who are out there and that can do the due diligence, kind of like CrowdCheck does the dotting I's and crossing T's now, and FactRight was here earlier, and he was doing some of the due diligence. And then StrataFund as a company up in Minneapolis. I know CEO Mark Snover, and they're doing ratings on companies and saying, okay, is it a 5 or is it a 1 rating on whether it's going to be good? And there's some differences between them, but I think the crowd needs to feel safe before they're going to get in, and I think there needs to be some way to disintermediate the lack of safety that's out there right now for the people to get in, because most people, whether they're accredited or investors or not, even the families of the family offices don't know how to do it. Their family offices know how to do the due diligence and know how to, look through it all. And they may not know a lot of it, but I think that's where we need to go is to get some more people in there to make it safer for the crowd to get in, to put their foot in the pool, is my thoughts.
I'll just comment about that because I come on about everything. Well, yes, and that's why I think I'm waiting for all the investment advisors to jump into the crowdfunding space, because I do think the crowd needs advisors, and that's another reason I think crowdfunding is going to be about funds, because there's safety in funds. And finally, I don't know if you listened to my rant or little speech yesterday, but I do think when we think in terms of changes in the law, most of the changes in the law proposed are to make the world better for issuers. And in my opinion, based on experience with consumer laws, what we need to focus on instead is making the world safer for investors. Consumers spend money when they believe they're being protected. And I think investors are more likely to invest when they feel that they are being protected. And so personally, I think the industry needs to focus on investors first.
I spoke to a registered investment advisor in St. Louis a couple weeks back, and he said, because of the fiduciary rule, he wouldn't recommend anything out there right now because it's just too unsafe. He would get a chance to have lawsuits against him or stuff. Now, that's kind of what I'm hearing, and that's where that change needs to happen somehow. And I'm not in that world, so I don't know enough to talk about that.
Well, nothing is safe or unsafe because it's new, or because crowdfunding hasn't been. I mean, an investment opportunity is safe or unsafe based on its own merits. Now, crowdfunding, as people have commented and commented and commented, is just a marketing channel. Crowdfunding, this is just a way of getting the good news out to potential investors. It doesn't change the fact that what they're hearing about is an investment opportunity that stands or falls on its own merits, and including how transparent the issuer is willing to be about the information and the disclosures and all the other factors beyond just the investment itself, but who are the team of people who are supporting the issuer? Are they working with, for example, Jones Company to make sure that I's are getting dotted and T's are getting crossed? I mean, crowdfunding doesn't change that. It may make it easier or harder, for that matter, if poorly done. I think it affords the opportunity to allow transactions to happen in greater volume involving more people. And if everybody behaves themselves, it can really enhance the level of activity. But at the end of the day, everything drills down to the particular investment opportunity and whether it makes sense and whether the investor can make his or her own decision about whether this investment makes sense for them personally. And it goes back to, I think, the initial step, the initial obligation in due diligence is the investor's own. After the company's obligation to put information out there and to be accurate and transparent, complete in putting information, the investor has got to make the decision based on collecting information, not being lazy, and reading that information themselves. And that's where due diligence starts. And then all the rest are enhancements to a better understanding of why this is a reasonable investment. I hope that crowdfunding never becomes an escape excuse for an investor to say, I don't have to do any work. I can just pick something, watch the marketing video, and make an invest. I mean, you're an idiot if that's the basis on which you make an investment decision, especially when people like William and Mark and I, and frankly, the other providers here in this room are getting paid because we do a lot of important work, most of which is getting information to people so that that decision's a better decision. There's no substitute for people taking the personal responsibility to be involved in their own investment decision.
Yeah, I think that the comment from an investment advisor, I'd never recommend these things because they're just too risky. That's nonsense. It's just it's a cover for, I just don't want to look at these things. I just don't want to spend the time. They don't fit into my comfort zone technologically. I can't track them the same as I do other investments, which is what Blaine's company solves. But when you look at the specific investments, and I've made a bunch of crowdfunding investments myself, when you look at specific investments and you look at a real estate developer, for example, who has been doing this for 15 years and the track record is there, and it's a Regulation A offering, and it's been qualified by the SEC, meaning they've combed through the disclosures with a fine-tooth comb, and you have audited financial statements and this track record, which tells you that on average they've been generating X% per year for the last 15 years. to say that, well, I just couldn't recommend that because it's new and unsafe, it doesn't mean anything other than I would never recommend a real estate investment. I would never recommend a REIT. But there's nothing about the distribution channel, the fact that it's being sold online, that would make one of these investments inherently better or worse than the same product distributed via FedEx. Are you going to agree or are you going to disagree? Then no. Here.
Hide the mic.
Okay, here's my 2 cents, and I'm not as knowledgeable as you are about it, but it's been my experience that the last thing a wealth manager wants to do is recommend anything that might possibly in a million years lose money, because that's their big fear. That their client calling them up and saying, "How could you recommend this? I lost my money," and that's every wealth manager's big fear: losing the principal of an investment.
But that's no different outside of crowdfunding than it is in. That's no different outside of crowdfunding than it is inside of crowdfunding.
I'll tell you why it's different. But Betty, we bought IBM. But Betty, we bought Apple. It's bound to go back up. That's okay. But if I say, Betty, I want you to invest in this Broadway show. I think Broadway, this is a wonderful show. They got great songs and everything. It's just a wonderful investment for you.
I got an answer for you. Here's my answer for you. Better. You know the old saying, how to end up making $1 million in the movie business? You invest 5, okay? So, long before crowdfunding ever reared its ugly or beautiful head, depending on your perspective, people were investing in movies. Most of them were losing their shirt on most of the movies in which they invested. And crowdfunding would not have saved those. Nor would crowdfunding, in my opinion, have caused those movies to be garbage that no one wants to go and see. And so, honestly, I really think that you need to do, as Mark suggested, keep in mind that the essence of crowdfunding is a delivery mechanism. It is a way to bring investors and investment opportunities together so that they can contemplate an investment opportunity they wouldn't otherwise have known about. Beyond that, and beyond the additional technology enhancements that allow marketing and the transmission of information to be better than it used to be, it doesn't change really the game that much, it seems to me. It doesn't make it riskier. It doesn't make it worser or betterer, than what it was. So if you keep your focus on the fact that crowdfunding using the internet is merely a delivery mechanism, I think it should alleviate some of the concern that people have about the technology, because the technology doesn't make it bad or good. It just facilitates.
Okay, Blaine, definitely. But before Blaine speaks, I'd like to tell him.
Because he is the moderator.
The man with the mic.
So I've been listening to some really interesting things here, and one of them that comes to mind is straight from what you said of there's a lot of law and there's a lot of activity to protect investors, but what comes to mind is what's the method of protection? And the method of protection right now is disclosure. We'll tell you more so you can make a better decision. How about I posit that's not good enough? How about I posit that we can, and I'm not sure what it is exactly, but we can do far more than just have better disclosure. We could have requirements that companies do certain things, hit certain milestones, do a lot more than just tell you what they're going to do, even if what they're going to do is not so bright. Or in an incredibly crowded market where they have no chance of succeeding, or any other number of things. A very tactical thing that comes to mind, and I'm sure there are many other ways to look at this, is some sense of comparison. Right now, the disclosure for, say the real estate investment trust offerings on our site or on many other sites is wonderful for one. But is that good compared to the one next to it, compared to the one next to it, compared to the one next to it? And am I going to read all of them and retain enough to make a comparison? I don't think so. I don't think you can legislate good things into existence. So I think it's up to us as industry participants to figure out how to put more of this comparative information, almost sort of back of the box, quick and TurboTax kind of, check boxes. Yep, this one has this one has the other, but this one doesn't. And yes, it's still disclosure. But it's packaging disclosure in some way that's more digestible than read a 150-page PPM for every potential investment and hope that you know enough about real estate to know when it says a 3% transaction processing charge when properties change hands is 1% higher than the industry norm and 2% higher than some of the leading players. So that comparative information there is something I'd love to see how we can present to prospective investors, and I'm going to hand it to the guy next to me to figure out how to do that.
Well, yes, Joan. Joan has figured it out.
The answer.
Actually, I want to go back to what Dave was saying about the investment advisor who declined to look at projects because of the DOL fiduciary rule. I think actually that's a symptom of something that we experience a lot of in the securities industry, and that's that regulation, new regulation, different regulation, can have a chilling effect. And I think that's the big concern about the DOL fiduciary rule, of which much has been written, more than I ever wanted to read or have read. But I think that it has had exactly that effect on many people. I don't know what's going to happen, so I'm not going to move off the dime. I'm going to sit right here on the fence until I know which way this is going to fall, because if I have to adhere to a fiduciary standard, I don't know that I want anything to do with this segment over here. So that's a great example of legislation that's going to...
They don't know. I'm not going to do it.
Yeah. Yep, that's true. So I think that's a good example of legislation and regulation that can bring things to a standstill, which is why that's been so controversial. Now, when you look at the Jobs Act, it was the opposite of that. It was a pretty sweeping form of legislation that has brought about some big changes, which is what we've all been discussing. There are further changes proposed. Now, going back to what Blaine was just talking about, having Morningstar for crowdfunding, shoot, I think I might go off and form a company to do that. That sounds like a pretty interesting opportunity, because I personally think that investors, and this was true way before crowdfunding, it was probably true when people were living in caves. I've literally sat in front of investors with all the disclosure material in the world and had the person say to me, I really don't want to read this. Tell me what I need to know. Okay? I bet you've all had that experience.
And were those crowdfunded deals?
Nope, they were not.
Again, it's no different.
Exactly. But going back to the point that Blaine just made, I personally think that investors like small, digestible, clear information. So having a Morningstar system for mutual funds was a fabulous thing for people, because then you look at, it's rated in these 6 categories and it gets 2 stars here. Well, that sort of stinks. So probably I don't want to do that one. So I can look at the elements that are important to me and make a quick snap judgment and comparison on a whole bunch of different funds. We don't have anything like that in crowdfunding or even in private placement world.
And we'd like to, and we'd like to have one. We'd like to have one. There was a famous economist once, and he always used to predict interest rates, and he was always wrong.
But consistent.
It's like a weatherman.
Always consistent. And someone once said, someone said, I think his last name was Kaufman, Henry Kaufman. They're going to say, well, he's on Tuesday, he's going to make a big interest rate announcement. And the other guy said, and just think how important that would be, if he had ever been right. I think Morningstar actually is never predictive.
Nope.
It's used widely. I was a subscriber, but if you do back testing, their ratings are not predictive. So hopefully we'll get something. Pardon?
And they're upfront.
They are, and people still subscribe because, and I mean, I'm hopeful that.
Past performance, no guarantee of future gain.
Yes, I'm hopeful that technology will deliver something better
Big data
then
help.
yes, using big data. And the only other thing I will say, and I think what we're supposed to go until 5 this afternoon, this panel. When are we?
Everybody's left a long time ago.
Yeah.
She's the event manager here.
Okay. So I think we're ready to wind up.
Just another 10 minutes. We're out of here by 12.
Okay. Well, I think it's about 5 of. I don't know. This fiduciary obligation for investment advisors. I think this is an example, and what that said, I believe, was that investment advisors actually had to take into account the interest of their clients as they recommend. I mean, yes, and that is what caused such an uproar. And I would just say that is exactly the kind of thing, when I talk about making the world safe for investors, that's a perfect example of the arguments you get both ways. And of course, everyone in the industry says, no, we don't want the rule. We're going to get sued. It's going to be terrible. You're going to put us out of business. But in the end, when you make laws that make it safer for consumers, they have the effect of being good for the producers. Lemon laws allowed car manufacturers to sell more cars, as an example. The rules that make credit card issuers liable for fraud rather than the consumer makes us all use credit cards. And it's a little bit counterintuitive each time, because the producer always argues, no, that's going to kill my business. I can't possibly do that. I can't possibly take that risk. But in the end, these things end up helping consumers, but even more helping the producers. So it's always a difficult argument, because the vested interests are always arguing the other way. But in the end, I'm hoping we will move in that direction from a regulatory point of view. Does anyone else have anything to say?
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, we have one additional. Yes.
Kind of on this question of the disclosure and what is presented to the shareholder, and it's really to Mark and Michael. But based on Blaine's question of can we change that? And I just wonder if it's never really addressed when we're getting these new rules. Is this disclosure actually sufficient for a potential investor to make a decision? So how many investors, as you said, you hand it over, they ask you to read it for you. There is a risk in any investment, and that is you may lose all of your money. And is that sufficient to just plaster right on the beginning of your marketing video or in your PPM? You may lose all of your money, because every other risk is asking a layperson to make some kind of assessment of an industry that they don't understand, and does the risk factor, which we can write hundreds of pages of them, that this restaurant is in the floodplain and the 100-year flood is coming up, right? Yeah, I mean, I've seen every, and you have, as lawyers, we love to write them. They're just hypotheticals. But does that actually advance the whole thing? And so are we looking at disclosure generally from, especially as lawyers, as an overly burdensome thing are we trying to meet something that the SEC is requiring, or are we actually just overdoing it because we are very cautious in our own profession?
That's a great question.
I thought so too. I thought so too. And so does the federal government. The SEC has said too much is too much, in fact. And the idea of throwing absolutely every risk factor that could conceivably apply to an investment opportunity is actually concealing, as opposed to illuminating by flooding people with too much information. It's possible to have too much information. But I get the sense that we're all in agreement with the basic idea that what can really make crowdfunding work is by enhancing information to investors, while at the same time not relieving investors of their individual responsibility to make the ultimate decision and own it and participate in the education of themselves process. That's the federal standard that says allow the investor to make an informed decision, and he or she makes that decision, and it's their call. It's not the government's call. That's different from some states, including my own. California is more paternalistic and says it's not enough to give full disclosure, but we, the state of California, will make an independent assessment. If we think that California residents should not invest in this project, we will not allow it to be offered to California residents. We're talking about certified offerings. But that idea is a different idea than the federal standard that prevails, under the federal securities laws, which says as long as you give the buyer, full information, and he has the access to be supported by investment advisors and by brokers and by due diligence providers and other folks who help provide information. I philosophically, personally, think that the best circumstance is the federal standard as opposed to the California standard that allows individuals to make their own decision, to be responsible for their own decision, but to have the opportunity to make the best decision because additional information is made available to them, including through the internet.
And
Wait.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I also live in a paternalistic state. I live in Massachusetts, where we were not allowed to buy Apple stock when it came out because the state had decided that that was too risky.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
I'm on the same page as you. I think the federal standard is enough. I think that thinking should be required when investing. I realize not everyone engages in that practice, but I do think that people should be responsible or take responsibility for either their due diligence or lack thereof in making their investments. I think probably there's enough securities lawyers in the room that you've seen when issuers have been sued if a deal goes south or has problems, because people don't like to lose money. And even though they knew it was a real possibility, in many instances when they lose money, they decide to sue someone to recover it. What I do think that crowdfunding and fintech can do is make risk and disclosure information both more accessible and more digestible. I think Blaine's idea about having a rating system and comparative information is a fantastic one, because I really do think that that's something that most people these days, when you're looking at an investment like this, you're looking at it in a vacuum, because there is no comparison like that. Unless, some of us, maybe from personal experience, you've done different things. You've done a few different REITs or whatever it might be. So you have a little more exposure to it in comparison, but that's just in your own experience and nothing objective. So I think the real power in the internet here is the ability to make these investments more accessible to people, but right now we've built it and they're not coming in droves, but also to make it more digestible and understandable. I mean, I think reading a 100-page PPM is not most people's idea of a fun activity. Watching a video of the founder of the company talk through the business and maybe what he or she sees as the real risks in that business, and you can say there's a lot more of them, they're in the PPM, but here are the ones that I'm worried about as the founder of this business. But here's the opportunities that I see. Because at the end of the day, when you're investing, a lot of times you're investing in the people. You can look at something as an industry. I did a lot of investing at one point back a couple of decades in the trash industry, because they're not making any more places to put it. From a supply and demand perspective, it seemed like a good investment to me. So I researched a few companies, and there was one that when it came down to a certain level, I would buy it. And when it got up to a certain level, I would dump it, and I did it a number of times.
Dumping it.
Dump it. So to
Selling it. Dumping it, being a pun. Okay? And to me, this was something I looked at in terms of opportunity, and I thought, okay, this is a horse race that I'd like to be in. What's the right jockey, the right horse, the right stable? You're not just looking at, the horse race, and there is one coming up this weekend. You're also looking at what else goes into the management, the training, the care, the feeding.
Sure.
So at the end of the day, you're never really just investing in a product. You're investing in the people, the Steve Jobs that makes Apple run, as well as, because there were other iterations that could potentially have succeeded. if you look at any really successful company, you look far enough back, somebody else was probably working in parallel on that idea. Some companies fail, some companies succeed. So you really have to make your own informed decisions. But I think the real power of the intranet here is to make that information more accessible, more globally available, and more digestible and more deeply understood than reading the 100-page PPM, because it has the ability to give a lot more color and a lot more real touch to things. Now it's your turn again.
Okay, so I guess, I will say that I personally have begun in my first risk factor, and all the offerings I do says you might lose your money. It just starts there, because I've come to the same conclusion you have, that's what really matters. I think you have to look at the incentives of the people writing these documents. Me, you, Michael. We don't want to do a bad job. That's our first personal incentive. We don't want to be sued. We don't want our client to be sued. So we try to think of all the bad things that could happen. Okay? And we see that, we envision that in a complaint filed against our client. He failed to tell us this. So we think, oh, I want to put that in so that complaint couldn't be filed. There is no incentive to limit that list. None of us have that incentive. Instead, it's like barnacles on a boat. It keeps getting longer and longer. It never gets shorter and shorter. I do think the system doesn't work today in the crowdfunding world. I would bet 90% of investors do not read the disclosure documents. That's a failure. And we can say, well, they're responsible, they should have read them. But if it's not happening, then the system isn't working. I don't know what the answer is. It's troublesome to me that it's not working today. And I think from a lawyer's perspective, I think, we could convene a crowdfunding lawyers conference and try to come up with solutions. And they could be legislative solutions. They could be technology solutions, just as one piece of the puzzle of helping this industry grow. It would be really great if investors were getting and reading or understanding or seeing on video or however else it could be communicated, through 3D virtual reality glasses, in some way understanding what they're getting into, which they are not today.
Do you think that in the non-crowdfunding, pre-tech world, what percentage of people do you think were reading the memorandum then?
Very small.
Okay.
Yeah,
So that has not changed.
That has not changed. I think very few people have ever read disclosure documents. Now,
Most of them are in this room.
Now, back in the day when retail investors were not given a seat at the table and you had family offices doing the investments, the family office would employ a bunch of people who knew how to review deals. Okay, so to them, actually, and in many of those deals, there were no disclosure documents because the family office, the investor, was so sophisticated that it would vet the deal on its own. It didn't need anybody to describe the deal. So you could look at this as it was conceptually true that people didn't read the PPMs before, but it didn't matter because they knew how to do the due diligence. Now that we're moving into the retail world, now the problem becomes real. How do we educate our investors? And I think that's a real challenge for us sitting in this room. How do we make sure that investors make good decisions?
I know we're starting to wrap up, but along that line, I would suggest that all of our viewers and everybody who's here, if they're not already, become a member of this trade association, the Crowdfunding Professional Association, CFPA. It is the trade organization where we're trying to gather the people who work in this space to actually work on these kinds of problems. And then somewhat more specifically, potentially the sort of the lawyers' disclosure group, if it's not already a division or a segment of that organization, could become one, could be a working group on that topic. The related sister organization, CIFRA, Crowdfunding Intermediary Regulatory Association, is very focused on the regulatory and legal aspects of, call it Jobs Act in general, crowdfunding in particular. So I'd ask that anybody who's not already engaged, obviously the folks in the room, but any viewers listening now or seeing this in the future, participate in the organization that is meant to bring us together to solve for these problems.
Yeah, and if both of the remaining viewers who are still watching join, it will triple the membership. Okay.
No, we have 94 plus the
Okay.
two of us, 96.
Okay. Okay. I think we're going to wrap up then.
No, you can say a final, as they call it.
You just want me to thank you, Sydney. So thank you again. You're such a wonderful human being and a tremendous man. No, if they see you, they won't believe me. Okay, so thank you very much, Sydney, and thanks again. And that is the final word.
No,
Oh, no.
It's lunchtime. No, I just want to say, I want to say thank you for our crowdfunding audience, which we have a lot of followers. Thanks to you you write for a lot of for us for years, and Blaine and and you guys been very good. And, June, and Michael, new friends, and the new friends coming in. But I enjoy this. I will sit down and usually not doing the conference, but I go after look at those tapes for me and I make sure and I learn more after. So I really enjoyed it. I'm one of those people that I see your reruns, so admit it. Dad, and Perry Masons and some other old ones over there. Thank you again. But
Okay.
Thank you again.
Thanks, Sydney.
Thanks to audience at home. I appreciate it. Thank you. We'll see you next year. So.